Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. My name is Larisa Mann. I'm assistant professor in communication and media studies, and I run the McGannon Center here. We've had the pleasure of having Dr. Larisa Mann here as a visiting research fellow this semester, which has been fantastic. And we're lucky to have her here sharing her scholarship with us. So at McGannon, we are a small research center at the Rose Hill campus, and our focus is on the ethical and social justice implications of communication technology. I've been director now for about 2 years, and we're just kind of starting to really get the ball rolling on some new interesting events, of which the Technology and Society Lecture Series is one. The next big event we have coming up is Liz Losh, who is a pioneering scholar who's sort of in digital humanities, but also very critical of e-learning, is giving a great talk that's critical of MOOCs. And that's going to be on April 18th at Rose Hill. It's like a lunchtime talk. I scheduled it around one of my classes, so it's 11:30 in the special collections room at the Walsh Library. And if you're not on the McGannon newsletter, you can either just give me your email address or go to McGannonCenter.com and sign up, and you'll get all that information. But we're always looking for new people to get involved or to come to our events or to participate in other ways. And so I will keep you guys all posted on that. But anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Larisa Mann. And I've known Larisa for a number of years. I met her when I was doing my dissertation fieldwork in San Francisco. We were both at a music and tech, the Future of Music event, I think.
That's when we met face to face.
Face to face, but we met on the internet many years previous. So combining scholarship, teaching, journalism, mentoring, and activism with professional and community-based artistic practices, Dr. Mann enriches practical and professional experience with critical analysis and ethnographic research methods, and vice versa. Her scholarship and teaching interests include analyzing how changing global media infrastructures affect creative communities, and examining the relationship between law, sovereignty, and creativity. Mann's work addresses how marginalized and exploited communities use cultural practices to survive and flourish, and how legal, social, and business institutions interact with the goals and needs of marginalized people. On these and other topics, she has addressed business, scholarly, creative, artistic, and policy audiences, as well as been an advisor in legal cases. Her recent work includes What Can Feminism Learn from New Media and Communication and Critical Cultural Studies, White Faces in Intimate Spaces, Jamaican Dancehall and Global Circulation in Communication, Culture, and Critique, and Decolonizing Network Technology, Lessons from Dancehall and Transnational Culture in the Internet Age. She's currently working on projects that address how marginalized communities define their needs in the context of digital privacy and security, and on the survival of terrestrial pirate radio and ethnic radio. And she has a PhD in Jurisprudence and Social Policy from UC Berkeley Law School, and a master's in economic history from the London School of Economics. And it is my pleasure to welcome to our campus Dr. Larisa Kingston Mann.
Thanks so much. Thank you all for coming at somewhat late notice, I guess. And thanks so much for having me at the center in the first place, and the great itinerant experience of post-PhD life. Wonderful place to end up. I think I'll just jump into my talk because I have, fun stories to tell, because that's the best part about ethnography. I am happy to talk about how this relates to my other work or to my own experience, because I am also a DJ, a musician, and event organizer, as well as doing research on those kinds of things. But for now, I think I just want to get to the stories in the UK, and we can come back around to it at the end. Of course, people, please interrupt with questions at any time. I'm happy to talk or go off on a riff on any of these things. This is an earlier version of a title that I had for this talk, which I think also connects to the some probably questions that urban studies folks often address. Because one of the things that I became interested in before doing this work that led me to this work was thinking about how culture circulates in bounded ways, and that those boundaries can be a good thing for the communities who make that culture, but that especially in the technological realm, those boundaries are seen as limitations. So the idea is like communications technology enables us to cross boundaries, to reach out, to transcend geography. And what I'm interested in is some of the moments when we might think of what's lost when that happens, or what are the terms that dictate how those boundaries get crossed. And so I became interested in pirate radio as a sort of example of something that came out of a really interesting combination of physical and legal and cultural boundaries. And the cultural boundaries have to do with the sort of bad neighborhoods part. That is to say, reputation the idea of what a neighborhood, what kind of a neighborhood atmosphere is, what's a safe place to go to, what's a sketchy area. Those things are also often seen as it's always a bad thing to either have to go to those places or to be in those places, but there's ways in which that also structures the terms on which one engages with those spaces. And that structure can sometimes also foster really interesting things. So, as was in my bio, one of the questions I've always been interested in is how marginalized people foster their own power, cultural, but also including economic, social, all kinds of power. Maybe how can marginalized people use culture to gain power is part of what I'm interested in. And what I mean by marginalized is not necessarily either numerical minorities or invisible people, but people who are structured in relation to power in a way where they don't have access to it. So you can be visible but exploited, or visible but in a way that doesn't actually allow you to assert your interests. And what I'm interested in here is the way pirate radio in the UK, and I'll get to definitions in a minute because I mean a specific thing by that, allowed a certain group of communities and people of common interest to assert a kind of cultural force which has become and continues to be incredibly culturally influential, economically powerful, and in other ways a really interesting cultural force, and did it to a great extent on terms that were not dictated by any dominant media structures or dominant cultural forces in this case, England. And so I think this has implications for how we think about legalization of illegal cultural spaces and practices, or integration of people who are seen as isolated into legal systems and technological systems. That is, if people are able to do these kinds of things, not exactly on their own, but to some extent on the outside or from the margins. Maybe it's not despite being from the margin, maybe it's because of being from the margins. And so that's part of what I got really interested in. So, pirate radio in the United Kingdom is my first example for today. And what I mean by that is something a little bit more particular than the term initially might imply. So pirate radio usually just means people who broadcast on the air without a license. Radio waves pretty much everywhere in the world where the state has an interest in them, you have to get a license to broadcast on them. And if you don't, you're a pirate. That's the technical or the sort of standard definition. But within that, there's actually some flexibility. And historically in England, there's also a couple different scenes of pirate radio that happened over time. There's a very famous era in the 60s when pirate radio, they made a movie about it a couple of years ago, right, where there was on the ship and they were playing rock and roll because the BBC didn't want to play rock and roll. I'm not talking about that era. That's an interesting era for other reasons, but it's connected to completely different, for the most part, communities and cultural practices than what happens later. What I'm interested in is the pirate radio that comes out of the change in legal status that shut down most of those offshore stations and forced those broadcasters to move into other areas where they could be broadcasting without being caught. But also, that meant they took radio broadcasting into areas where people started to make their own radio broadcasts and make their own radio stations in urban areas, and especially in core urban areas. And what's interesting is that up until the present day, up until 2016, you still have an enormous amount of pirate radio in England. I'm going to talk mostly about London because that's where I was most recently, but it's true in most of the cities that I haven't had any chance to do research about. Even now with the rise of web radio, which again many people would say is an advantage in every way over terrestrial broadcast, you still have a lot of people broadcasting without a license on the air in urban areas. Not necessarily all the time, not necessarily 24 hours a day or 7 days a week, but there was a master's thesis written by a Danish student in 2010 where he clocked 80 stations in London alone. And I don't know if it's still 80 in 2016, but I was there last summer, and just walking around, I definitely found a lot of stations that were not affiliated with any legal station. Some were intermittent, many were not in English. It's a very interesting thing to do, to walk around with a radio, especially because millennials don't do that even in our cars or live in places without cars. So I encourage you to get a window into who's broadcasting by doing that. So anyway, pirate radio is still persistent. Oh, sorry, 88 in 2010. So this was part of the list. So another way to look at this is why is it persisting? Why is it still so important? Why is everybody not just moving online? And I think any media studies person who looks at practices would probably start with the idea that, well, probably broadcasting on the air serves a social function that is particular to that particular media practice, and that isn't easily met by other things. Maybe it's just people couldn't find any better way, but very likely there's some affirmative reasons why people are continuing to broadcast on the air. And if you look at how people talk about pirate radio in England, very quickly you get a lot of discussion, and this is an MC from the very famous DJ and MC crew called the Pay As You Go cartel, who talks about how pirate radio was embedded, especially in the rave scene, from the 80s again to the present. So, and I think this is really important and sort of underlies, I'm not going to talk as much about the rave scene, but it's important to recognize that the pirate radio is a node in a set of cultural practices around music that always involved parties, again, often in illegal spaces, people going dancing, a certain amount of drug taking, a certain amount of, again, happening in illegal locations, and music that you weren't going to hear, especially on mainstream radio stations, on legal radio stations, or celebrated in dominant media. So Maxwell talks about how pirates created a hub for the community, and so then the question becomes, well, what community was it? And what is it that made this, sort of the parameters of this hub, and what does it mean to create a hub for community? And what's interesting is if you look at when this started to happen, again, to go back a few years to the 70s and 80s, this is when pirate radio moved especially into public housing. It's not the only place that it existed or exists even now, but to a great extent, one of the places that became really well suited to hosting pirate radio broadcasts is public housing blocks in urban areas in London, or in cities, I should say. And this is I think, one of the more interesting sort of intersections of this history in particular, because pirate radio in England it's certainly from my observation, from anything I know of people involved in music, the most vital and active pirate radio music scene anywhere in the world. And England is one of the few places where public housing looks like this, to the exclusion of a lot of other architectural forms, and also upper class people, for the most part, didn't live in towers. And this has to do just with cultural assumptions in England. If you were middle class or above, you wanted a house, you wanted a garden. And so it was very difficult to convince middle and upper class people that they wanted to live in a place like this, until very recently. It's changing now. So you have more poor people in these towers, and non-poor people not in towers. And you have broadcasting where the higher you are, the weaker power your transmitter needs to be to reach a lot of people. So you can already see a kind of natural incubator. I'm going to come back to that. I'm just going to very briefly go into the legal context for pirate radio, just to get a sense of what structured this on the legal side. So the British state owns the electromagnetic spectrum, in theory, in Britain. And they divided these rights into two categories: the state radio, controlled by the BBC, and after a certain amount of time, what they called Independent Broadcasting Authority, which allocated commercial radio licenses. So you had state and commercial. Initially, I think it's in '73 that they really start to branch out, and this is because of the pressure of the first wave of pirate stations. So the first British radio didn't play rock and roll, didn't play a lot of music that the British state didn't see as consistent with the kind of state-building, uplifting purpose of mass media. And so you had pressure coming from very well-funded illegal radio broadcasts offshore, often funded by American music interests as well as other interests. And eventually, they create commercial radio licenses. Over time, and in different ways at different times, there's been a third set of licenses created called community radio licenses that are available. Usually it's more low-power broadcast. It's tied often to local radio. And in general, they are supposed to have the goal of providing representation to social groups that are underserved, marginalized, neglected, or misrepresented by mainstream media. So we might think that pirate radio would fit really easily into this category, but actually it doesn't turn out to ever do so that well. So community radio licenses had a lot of requirements. This is one of the most famous and long-running. This is from a newspaper ad, so sorry for the poor quality scan here. Radio Jackie. Community radio had to be nonprofit. It couldn't take advertising for the most part. It wasn't supposed to be primarily for entertainment purposes. It couldn't be all music, for example. It had to be tied to public purpose, including news, education. Again, there was a real interest often in local, in representing the local. And these are all things that each time community radio licenses sort of come up, it's kind of tied to the whims of the particular government at the time. So as you might be able to deduce, community radio licenses tend to come up when labor is in power. The idea that they should need this kind of support rather than be able to get it from the market is, so would be associated with labor. But even there, you still get a concern that it needs to be worthy. Community radio needs to have worthy things on it. And it doesn't mean it has to be big stuff, but it needs to be things that we can point to and say this has real community benefit. And so what's interesting is pirate radio kind of falls between the cracks of both, pirate radio that grew in the 70s and 80s falls between the cracks of community licensing and commercial licensing. I should point out as well that, of course, all of these legal stations have to pay copyright royalties and also have requirements. Even commercial radio had requirements for the amount of times they could play, for how much time they could play music. They had limitations that had to do with the idea that royalties should be allocated fairly, so you shouldn't keep playing music too many times. All kinds of restrictions and other restrictions on content, as you might expect, programming content. And community radio had its own set of restrictions on content as well. So again, pirate radio is one of the sort of illegal broadcasting categories that comes up in the cracks of these other legal requirements. There's also something sometimes called free radio. These are sort of self-claimed categories. Free radio is illegal, but usually self-identified as political, mainly talk, often run by anarchist or sort of usually extreme left, occasionally extreme right anarchist folks who don't want to be on legal radio, don't want to be licensed, but mostly don't play a lot of music and aren't necessarily associated with, say, the rave scene, for example. Sometimes they are. There is overlap between them. But again, pirate radio is this last category. And it falls across a lot of really interesting binaries, which are also, you might say, tied to sort of ideological ideas about what culture is for. So pirate radio is not necessarily not-for-profit. It certainly a lot of the times takes advertising, usually advertising from people throwing the raves, whether it's a legal venue or an illegal venue, also for liquor, also for other, equipment or accoutrements or things associated with the rave scene. So not necessarily nonprofit. Sometimes also it takes other kinds of advertising from local businesses. These would usually be businesses who couldn't afford to take out advertising on a commercial station, so it ties it to a kind of, it's not non-profit, but it's maybe low profit or locally based profit to some extent. It's also not community enough for community radio licensing. That doesn't necessarily mean it's individualistic. It's often characterized as antisocial, partly because people are doing it illegally, and partly because it's associated with these parties and raves that are themselves often seen as kind of socially destructive. And it's usually not seen as political, and in fact, even a lot of the people involved in it at various times will say that it is entertainment, it's just music. At the same time, if you look at the communities involved and you look at the people who are engaging in these musical practices, again, something I think familiar to people who do media studies, it obviously has a politics to it because it's a very particular set of people who are involved. And so these are people whose faces, voices, interests, accents, stories are not welcome or not represented in dominant media, then simply the act of being present is a kind of politics. And there are interesting times when pirate radio and rave scene in general intersect with other kinds of politics about public space, from reclaiming the streets to squatting to border camps. And right now, in fact, a whole lot of people involved in the rave scene in the UK are currently working in the jungle in Calais in the refugee camp. So there's really interesting intersections there. But again, it doesn't fit easily within certainly the kinds of categories that the British Licensing Commission understands for what a license is supposed to look like. So, to do pirate radio from the 80s high until now, in general, costs have been very low. This is even more true now as equipment gets smaller and smaller than it was then. But it's never been super expensive to build a transmitter, to set up turntables or CD players or whatever else it is you're making with music. You obviously don't have to pay licensing fees if you're doing it legally. You also don't have to pay royalties. And up until recently, fines were actually not unbelievably high. Over the years, this has changed. It's changed according to political whims. But it certainly is, and at various times, they couldn't confiscate your equipment without a judge's order, and so it took a long time to get a judge's order, by which time, even if they raided you, you'd already absconded. So there are a lot of ways in which the kind of speediness and low-techness of pirate radio managed to keep people sort of able to move one step ahead of law enforcement. And also a fair amount of community support. And I would say that that is also something that operated even at the geographic and architectural level in ways that hasn't often been discussed, which I think is really interesting. So as I said before, tower blocks. This is one of the many sets of blocks of flats in Tower Hamlets, London, which is one of the places that's been the home to a great many pirate radio stations. Obviously good for broadcasting. You put a transmitter on top of there, you're going to reach a lot of people. It can also go very far, a lot farther if it's high up. But even if it doesn't go that far, you get a lot of people in a small space here. But also it's extremely hard to monitor what's happening physically in these locations. If you want to do a raid, one of these apartments has a studio in it. You can't triangulate very well. And, to be frank, if you're police and you show up and you say to someone living in there, where's the station, they don't necessarily have a great deal invested in telling you. And there's not a lot of ways in which you're going to know. And this would be true, I think, anywhere. But it's especially true when you remember that these are places that, on the whole, didn't get a lot of policing. They weren't likely to see police as someone who's there for them in the first place. And over and over again, what I've heard from people I've talked to involved in the scene, given there's bias, of course, involved in that, when there are complaints, they aren't coming from anywhere inside these houses, which makes sense because pirate radio broadcasting doesn't necessarily physically interfere with your ability to do go through your life in your own apartment. It can interfere with the transmission of other radio stations, and so usually the complaints are from another station who says this is blocking our signal. So I did, when I was in London recently, meet with a couple people who have worked as building managers in these places, and both of the ones that I talked to the most said they'd never, in the years that they worked there, ever had a complaint about pirate radio from within the houses. It always came from the government. And they also often said they felt fairly ambivalent about letting them in. They seemed fairly sympathetic to, and also said as well, what would people have to complain about? From the government side, there's a concern. They often talk about, if you read the numerous articles that, especially it's now called Ofcom, the British commission that overlooks broadcasting and heads these raids. They talk about the dangers of people running aerials, and maybe they're climbing on the outside of the building, or they're interfering with knocking down someone's television aerial when that was something that could happen. But there also isn't a lot of evidence of, they also talk about interfering with emergency broadcasting, which again, there hasn't been in the US either, as far as I know, any case of this ever being documented that it has happened, although of course it is a concern with broadcasting. So again, you have both a physical and a kind of cultural interest in, at least, I don't know what that is. Look, there's an area. Yes, the dictionary has decided to define London for us. Okay, so again, another shot of a block of flats. Actually, I think this is also Tower Hamlets, another set of buildings in Tower Hamlets. So Tower Hamlets is not. It sounds like it could be a name of a single housing project. It's actually a name of a region that was built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s as a public housing area, but it's much bigger than just a couple buildings. And by the 70s was, I think, 80% housing for the poor. And again, over time, the definition of which kind of poor was supposed to be in this housing has changed according to different political interests. But in general, I think it is, again, significant that you have broadcasting to a community that is actually predefined by the architecture and the sort of rental agreements of the space. What's interesting is, again, as I said before, towers are not entirely, but to a great extent, for housing reserved for poor people. So you have this sort of happy accident of broadcast space. I found this great article about the history of public housing in England that talked about, in fact, in the 60s, when the great post-war waves of rebuilding were going on, certain areas were actually given tax breaks and financial bonuses for every story they built above a certain level. So there was a real interest, and again, there's only certain parts of the community that were expected to live in these towers, but they really were going for height. They wanted them to be, they actually paid per floor to get them higher and higher, which I just thought was an interesting statistic. So again, the reason I may seem like I'm belaboring the point is that it's not just about a place that's unmonitored and neglected and therefore you can stick an antenna in it. It's also that actually middle-class architecture is not good for broadcasting. People will notice your aerial if you put it up. You won't be that much higher than your neighbors. It's more diffuse. You won't necessarily reach as many people. And so it's actually a structural advantage to some extent for people to be living in towers for radio. You actually have a better setup for your radio. And as you might expect, this sort of set of practices over time builds up a set of local knowledges about what happens in these towers. So talking to, one DJ, they might say, look, I was in this area. Of course, it was like a maze. I got lost. And I'll show you, I have a street map of when I was in Tower Hamlets, because that's actually where I stayed last summer. And it's amazing. It is a maze. It's very clearly that the streets are designed as well to keep people in as much as to keep people out. There often only would be one entrance, one road in to a whole maze of streets. And I'll show you what that looks like. But he said, like, this old Jamaican man clocked my bag. He saw that I had a record bag. And he said, are you looking for the studio? And help me find it. So it's not that these places are completely isolated, but it's that once you're there, you have to actually engage with local people on their terms, right? They have to feel like letting you know what's going on, right? So there's a way in which participating becomes structured by, not necessarily, you don't have to be from that place, but you have to sort of learn how to get along with that place, how to get along with what's happening in that place, and people have to see you as having value to that place, to want to come with you. So here is this street map. I don't know if you can see. So this is, I use a Google map. So here's me and my blue dot. And I was trying to get to a giant tower that I could see really well that was over here. But if you'll notice, these are all dead ends, right? And they're often dead ends around corners, which means if you don't have Google Maps, you just come around a corner and you're like, okay, and then you go back. So you can imagine, and you can't see, so here's a rail station up here, and there's a main road up here that goes along. But there's not that many ways to get in from the main road. And so once you get in, you're just in this area, and there's also this other train track, so you can't cross over here. There's another train tracks running through here, right? So it really, if you don't know your way around, it's going to take you a long time to find anything. And even if you do know your way around, it still can be very difficult. So there's a way in which, again, locals end up having a lot of advantages over knowing what's going on in the space. And again, not to belabor the point, but if, someone from outside, police or otherwise, comes in looking for anybody, and nobody feels like helping you, it's really, really difficult to get your way through these spaces, certainly not quickly. So there's a whole lot of ways in which other kinds of authority become filtered out or muted in these locations. And there's certainly a lot of ways in which this isn't a good thing, and there's a lot of discussion in public housing here and in England as well about these spaces as sites of neglect and places where crime is rampant. I think that is an important aspect of both what the reality of living in these places is like, but also that narrative in itself is a filter, right? You have a sort of bad reputation that filters out people coming to these spaces. And so, another DJ that I spoke to who came from Essex first he played on a radio station in Essex and then eventually made his way to play on Cool FM, which was one of the biggest stations in London in the 90s. He said, and he didn't come, by the way, from a wealthy or sheltered part of Essex. he came from a housing estate, but it was a slightly less dense and entirely white housing estate. And he talked about in other parts of the interview, his access to this music was also ended up being his access to multiracial spaces and to sound system and Black culture. But what I like here is, again, it's not that you can't come into these places if you're from the outside, but it's that you have to negotiate your entrance into these spaces. And this, again, is where this idea about isolation and boundedness, I think, is important. That is, there are some positives to this. There's this positive to the fact that people from outside couldn't just sail in whenever they wanted to participate in these cultural practices at will and leave, right? You had to be recognized as someone who had something to bring, and that you weren't just leaving with your, with your bag of recordings, of field recordings, and heading back to make your mixed CD somewhere else, right? You were here to play radio in this community, brought your records to the community, and then you went home to wherever you went home to, right? And this set of relations, I think, is really interesting. So, the advantage of this illegal musical space, and this is a bunch, you can see there's some various transmitters rigged up on top of this building, is you can also avoid regulation of audio content. You're not dependent on changing state attitudes, because one of the problems with community radio stations is that they're perennially, when another government gets into power, all the funding is cut, and then they're gone. So, and the same with any sort of reliance on, and to some extent this is even true of public housing itself in the present. For the first time, a lot of housing activists, that I spoke with in London, are grappling with the idea that the state is not actually interested in housing the poor at all as a thing. It used to be that, how people were housed was the issue, but now they're converting high-rises also to luxury apartments. They found a way to make it appealing to people who wouldn't before have lived in towers. And it's not clear whether this former public mission of public housing has got legs, at least in the government. From many people's perspective, they're concerned about this. So anyway, in this illegal space, not only are you not dependent on this kind of chancy support by the state, but you also have freedom to experiment, to learn, to make mistakes in a creative practice. And I think this shared creative practices is something that is both built and reinforced through the radio. So this is the same DJ from before, the guy who was coming from Essex. It was a hardcore rave station, lots of dance music, and he was coming in to play soul and jazz. And he said, to some extent my listeners were people who just wanted to hear what I had to play, but I sort of pushed him on who those listeners were. And he said, well, yeah, it's probably a lot of it was the parents of the people who were going out raving all the time. So it's not that it was unfamiliar music, it's that it was music that had another angle into the community. There's this way in which it all becomes a kind of self-referential or a circular kind of relationship, reinforcing relationship. And it's also important, again, that this is dance music. Dance music in the UK has a lot of aspects of creative practices that also don't function well on commercial radio stations. Everything from the fact that there's lots of remixing, there's lots of reuse of recorded music, things that are not necessarily permitted without a separate license, a copyright license. But it's also highly interactive, even on the radio. A lot of times people are calling in, people are emceeing over the music. People will replay a song 5 or 6 times if someone wants to hear it 5 or 6 times, or if the DJ feels like playing it 5 or 6 times. So there's ways in which the format and the practices are also something that are not allowed or allowable on legal radio stations for a lot of different requirements. Until 1990, there was an agreement with the Musicians Union that was actually limited playing recordings on the air as well. So because it was understood that you were maybe putting live musicians out of business, you actually literally couldn't play so many hours of recorded music in a row. So there's really interesting restrictions that shaped what then made pirate radio very attractive. And again, you have different kinds of interactive practices. So you see here a guy emceeing. What's also really interesting is, again, the way people involved in this scene made use of infrastructure in really interesting ways. So people in the cell phone era, but before the broadband era, people would communicate via missed calls, so because you wouldn't get charged for it, right? So if you played a tune and tons of people liked it, they might just ring you up and hang up. You get a bunch of hang-ups, but that would be like everyone giving you a thumbs up or whatever. Like that meant that people were into it. So they were sort of using the phone system, but finding a way to not have to pay for using the phone system. People also did this with text messages or with beepers. They found ways to sort of encode encouragement or discouragement, and people on the mic were very savvy about making use of that. Part of having interactiveness was keeping people interested in the music. So a lot of these practices really centered on these illegal spaces. And again, not for nothing, you could play stuff obviously on pirate radio that you couldn't play anywhere else. And I was really delighted to find this great quote from Paul Gilroy. Talks about this song by Stevie Wonder that was not a big hit in the US, produced by Stevie Wonder, I should say. Gary Bird and TV Experience played it, called The Crown. And it's extremely political in content, but the reason it probably never would have been played, or in fact wasn't ever played on the radio as far as I know, commercial radio, is that it was also a 10-minute song. So, but it was very, very popular in the early era of the Pirates on some of the more soul and jazz and reggae oriented Pirates especially, but even at other times, especially like, again, the guy whose quote I had before had a Sunday afternoon show. You might expect soul and jazz for everybody recovering. You might hear, one of these songs as well, both political in content, but also just by format, not welcome on the station. So these are sort of the constellation of practices that come out of these spaces. So again, there's a tower block. Here we have this kind of maze-like set of streets, which again was quite common in other areas as well, quite common in public housing projects. So just to get at the politics a bit more, part of what you get in non-political music, and music that doesn't have lyrics, for example, like the one I just showed you, is the politics of who is engaged in the music, right? So it is important, again, that pirate radio was especially centered on working class, black and white mostly, although some Asian as well. Men, for the most part, on the air, although there was often like one or two women DJs on a lot of the different stations, but certainly overwhelmingly male. The dance floor, however, which again isn't separate from pirate radio because it was so embedded in the rave scene, is where you would see a lot more women participating. And again, not only, and especially in England, the rave culture became much more popular, but it starts from marginalized communities whose music and whose stories are not being heard in other places. And then you also have, again, as I said before, the politics of media reuse itself. That is, the ability to treat recorded music like raw material for further use. This is something that, for interesting reasons, has come out of especially colonized people. Jamaican sound system culture is one of the pioneers of this, and Jamaican sound system culture is very connected to the rave scene also through the technology as well as the music. These are people who innovated in producing mobile sound systems for people who were dancing, who innovated in producing sound systems with enormous amounts of bass, which was something that people really wanted. Also, Jamaicans were much more visible in the production side of radio and music, even when they weren't visible on the radio side, on the DJ side. So there's a kind of politics, but it's not a kind of politics that can be seen as representational for the purposes of, say, a community radio license. And what I think fosters this ability to be political, again, is this location, the ability to have this kind of politics. If this location was not isolated, if this location was not repeatedly and both legally and physically and sort of reputationally associated with marginalized communities, if it was easily permeable by all kinds of people, you wouldn't get this concentration of sort of cultural energy. You wouldn't get this interest in participating and in creating. I mean, the sort of energy that goes into pirate radio over and over again. And if people did get shut down, and they would come back. They would start again the next day. They would have a bank of extra transmitters, and when one got confiscated, they would go to the next. If you talk to people about it, their interest in perpetuating this is really palpable. And I think it comes from the idea that you're gaining a kind of social power. You're sort of making your mark. There's also certainly, for some people, the thrill of illegality itself, or the thrill of flouting authority, and that kind of thing. But I do think there's also this importance of claiming space when people don't give you space and claiming it on your own terms. And this is the connection to, if you remember the phrase from the flyer, a couple of the flyers, this concept of exilic space. I was starting to be interested in whether pirate radio, or in some ways, some of these towers themselves functioned as what might be called an exilic space. And I'll tell you why I'm interested in this. So my earlier work is in Jamaica. It was on Jamaica and Jamaican cultural practices. And Obika Gray is a Jamaican sociologist who talked about the authority of gangsters in Jamaica as a political force that relies on a power that is not dependent entirely on the state. And that poor people who have a choice, because the state can't actually support them, the state in Jamaica is not that powerful, choose to ally themselves, or have the option to ally themselves with an authority that is not dependent on British colonial power. So it's interesting, it's not necessarily more equal, it's not necessarily entirely liberating, but it is a way of aligning yourself with a set of interests and a set of identities that are not tied up with colonial or imperial power. And so when people are identified as, like, where their very presence is seen as threatening or negative, the idea is you need a space where you can be not just not seen as threatening, but have the exact same characteristics be validated, be valorized. And what Gray suggests is if you have this kind of space, this space in which you can do this, you can sort of assert your own identity on your own terms, you have a kind of social power which you can then take with you, which you can actually force people to negotiate on your terms to some extent, culturally, legally, economically, in all kinds of ways, because you're not fully dependent on it. And I think of this, to me this echoes a little bit what I was saying before about one of the problems with trying to depend on, say, the community radio license, right, is that you get in, but you're not really in, and it can be taken away at any time. Whereas if you have your own transmitter, if you have your own space, you in fact, you have the threat of being arrested, you have certain other kinds of threats, but you also have a way of defining what you want to do that is not monitored, that is not surveilled in exactly the same way. I actually came to this looking at Jamaican street parties, and I can talk more about how I think that's a better example because it's actually happening in a place where the state has very, very little power. And the funny paradox here is, of course, we're talking about public housing as providing the capacity for exilic space, but you don't get public housing without a state, which is kind of amazing. So I'll just say I think this irony and this kind of contradiction is embraced very much by pirates themselves. So one of the most famous early pirate radio stations was the DBC, the Dread Broadcasting Corporation. So clearly they are, playing on this idea of the BBC, and if you know, dread doesn't just refer to hair, dread also has to do with a kind of alternate sensibility, with a comfortableness, with even apocalyptic visions of the world, that are visions that are certainly understandable if you're the descendants of enslaved people, right? So you get a kind of, not just a reversal, I think, of a state radio station evoked here, but you actually get this kind of subversion and commentary on it in a very interesting way. And I should say that the fact that it's a cassette, of course, is not accidental either, because one of the other ways that this music circulated in the pre-digital era was on cassettes, and this is another thing that keeps it outside, under the radar of a lot of other kinds of surveillance. And again, people talk about this in terms of file sharing, as well as streaming. There's ways in which circulating information and music online seems easier, but to a great extent, especially now, is trackable and surveillable. And so at every step of convenience, you also get this step of visibility, and visibility on its own is not liberating if what you are seen as is threatening or subordinate. So tape circulation goes along with pirate radio, goes along with parties and illegal spaces as creating a kind of network that is at the margins, or to some extent invisible, and therefore extremely valuable. So I think I've hit these points already, pretty much. One of the sort of endpoints I came to was, this I think is part of why web radio has not wiped out pirate radio, but it's not just a sort of argument for the kind of content and ideological or cultural practice arguments for why web radio is inadequate. There's also just the fact that when you're talking about things like bandwidth, you literally are not, it's not yet equal access, right? So bandwidth tracks class and race. This is a map of broadband availability, which is not, of course, to say people can afford it if it's there, but even availability, this is Tower Hamlets, and red is slow. You can see Tower Hamlets is already slower in many places than, this is the Thames, than a lot of other places. It would be interesting to look at how these things map, obviously class and race. In most places they do map onto class and race. I found a really interesting study on Hackney, which is the area in London that has the highest the digital divide or the lowest access. I think 26% of Hackney residents in 2012 didn't use the internet at all, which is interesting. But what I liked was they had this, just a correlation study that said, in their work in this one area, the things that made a household most likely to lack internet: diverse home shares, renting flats in densely populated areas, tenants in social housing flats on estates at risk of serious social problems, and childless low-income tenants in high-rise flats, older people relying on state support. Certainly the top 3 of these are also places where you would have found a pirate radio station to a great extent. Not the only places, again, but certainly that's definitely what people describe as where you would often have a pirate radio station, right? So just to highlight that if there is no, not only is there no advantage for poor people in web radio yet, in the way that there was with FM broadcasting, there still is just a material disadvantage. It is more expensive, it is not reliable, it is not necessarily available, and it's monitored and tracked and all the other things. So the flip side, again, is offline is not necessarily less connected, because when you have offline radio, it's in a social context that is geographic, that is cultural, that is material. So you're not just accessing it on your device, you're in a neighborhood, and you know what that neighborhood is, and the people in the neighborhood see you, and you see them, and you see the buildings. There's a whole lot going on there besides you interacting with media, and I think that's very important. I had a couple other points to make, but I think I'm going to stop there. I will just say, this is ongoing work. There's a lot of different people who are talking indirectly about this. Richard Barbrook is one of the only people who talks directly about pirate radio, but I think to some extent a lot of these, as well as other folks, have angles on both pirate radio and other kinds of illegal cultural practices that might suggest something. I will say on the Gilroy analysis, why we might need these as anti-colonial spaces for Black culture. It's also true that there was a 2013 study by survey by Ofcom that said something like 20% of Londoners listen to pirate radio, but 40% of Black Londoners listen to pirate radio. So clearly it's mapping onto some kind of interest and need that is not necessarily being met in other places. And so, some of the other stuff I talk about in my other work, but I'll just leave that there for now and say, I'm really interested in going forward with this. I also have work on ethnic radio in New York, but there's a whole other set of concerns and practices there. And I think one of the things that's really clarifying here is both the really explicit contrast of having state radio, right? That is the BBC having a really explicit cultural mission that explicitly, for example, kept music of poor people, kept Black music off the air on purpose, explicitly saying we don't want this kind of thing. Whereas the commercial exclusion of that kind of stuff is a little bit more complicated. And in fact, the commercial inclusion is also complicated. That is, being included again, you could be included on terms you don't like, right? So what I like about the British example is that it gives you a chance to really have these kind of opposites that are quite clear, because it gets much muddier when you don't have state radio in the same way to kind of clarify the filtering process that's happening for what occurs in these different broadcast media. So I'll stop there. Thank you guys so much for sticking with me.
We have nearly 10 minutes and 15 minutes for questions. Yeah. If people have responses or questions for Dr. Mann.
So you briefly mentioned some of the issues of gender around this, and that there kind of is a lacking of female presence for sure. But I'm curious about kind of what's that say about maybe this particular, or maybe what does it reflect around with this particular practice, and maybe possibly antagonistic politics also.
Can you say what do you mean by
Oh,
antagonistic?
well, I guess you said that. So at least from my perspective on this, one thing that immediately popped into my mind was that, okay, that a kind of antagonistic politics against the state is a riskier business that is not usually associated with women. And so is that part of it? Are there other reasons that they might not be present in the space?
Two things, and I think they both go to what you're saying. So one thing that's really interesting is though women are an extreme minority in terms of certainly media representations of pirate radio, although if you go back you'll often find there usually were female DJs at various times. What's interesting is that when it comes to DJs, and a lot of pirate radio DJs in the past have crossed over into being hired by the BBC, and a really large percentage of those are women, which I think supports your point, right? That is that there's a way in which female voices and sort of female embodiment even, right, is read as less threatening to the state. And I think when you're talking about working class white and black males, voice and body are de facto read as a threat in a different way. And again, that's sort of what the politics of the music is about. Like a lot of the times the music is not saying we have this approach to the state, or we have this attitude to the state, but it's often saying the state has an attitude towards us, like it has a depiction of everyday life, right? So then that's very much recognizable in music, I would say. And I think also to the point about risk, I mean, I think that also there's just the other aspect of risk in general, which is that you are talking about both, what happens to you if you get caught, but also if you're going into a space not on your own terms, what's at stake if you are a woman as opposed to a man. Certainly it's not constructed as the same kind of risk. I think there's definitely, I have like a fantasy project that I want to go find because the thing is a lot of the women who are involved in pirate radio, the ones who don't go legal, all just drop out of the story. Whereas like I was interviewing people who had been doing pirate radio in the 80s and 90s, who were still doing radio. Some of them still doing pirate radio, but it was all the ones who lasted that long were all the guys. So I would love to go find out. I mean, I have a clear idea of probably what happened to most of the women, because it's true in lots of the arts and many other places. But it would be interesting to find more of that story.
I think it would be interesting just also in the U.S. history, I don't know anything about London's kind of history of housing and urban development, but in the U.S. that especially even women of color were like this legitimizing force that their names were on leases more often, and so that they were also governed by a slightly different set of rules to keep their properties and stuff like that.
I didn't know about that, and that's a super helpful point, because it's true, like a lot of the stations were in people's apartments. Like you put the aerial up top, and you'd be like, I have lots of interviews with people, and they're like, we were in someone's kitchen with the turntables. And it'd be interesting to know, who's on the lease. And that, because that's super interesting. I'm actually going to make note about that. That's great. Yes.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm wondering, so let's say that map that you showed us of the poor broadband connectivity. Let's say that map disappeared and we lived in this fantasy world that's not going to happen, but there was full digital equality.
Right.
Do you think that this kind of practice would persist? And for what reasons?
Yes, I think it would, to some extent, in that, whatever digital equality might mean, it doesn't mean any other kind of equality. So, sort of like I was saying before, right, it's certainly not going to be more easy for poor people to do web radio than wealthy people, for a lot of other reasons that have to do with how life is structured by forces beyond the internet. So, I think that's why I didn't want to start with like the technical stuff, because I think it's true, like certainly until we have like the fastest broadband in the world everywhere for free or something. But I mean, in a way, the British example kind of gives that anyway, because that's what public housing was supposed to be, was this sort of universal kind of floor for everyone, and instead you also get these kind of ways. So I mean, I think part of it is that if the technical side were the same for everyone, the other cultural things and the other material resources and aspects, certainly I would be interested to know what happens to programming choices. I mean, that's one of the things that's interesting, is like what structures programming choices now, especially because now, a lot of pirate radio that is, that I heard when I was in London this time, some of it was nostalgic, like I was playing music from the 90s. And then a lot of it was playing stuff which you could hear some version of also on the pirate stations that have gone legal. So Rinse FM being the biggest one, they got a radio license, and they were one of the biggest pirates. And they still are playing a lot of club music, but all of that, has become popular culture and become perhaps less disruptive. So I would be curious to know what's happening now that isn't those things, that's off the radar, right? What I heard on the radio more was ethnic radio from like people whose languages aren't heard. So I heard like Greek and Hindi and a few other things when I was like going through, but I didn't, and other name, I think Turkish and other things I couldn't identify, but definitely that was what seemed to be much more on the pirates. So I'd be interested to know. I think that's partly not to do with the technology, but to do with the fact that the old British imperial attitude about culture has also changed. That is, it used to be, we didn't let that come to us because that would taint us. And now it's, no, we can take that stuff and commercialize it for the American ones. No, it's not going to taint us, we're just going to sell it back to them, right? So it's a different attitude. So I think that's also part of it, is like that people have found a way to repackage it, and that didn't used to be something that was seen as possible.
So it seems like the circumvention of licensing, fee, royalty, collection systems, regulatory fees, stepping on someone else's frequency that pays for those things, properly. Those are kind of legitimate bases for objecting to pirate radio. But through your research, have you kind of seen any legitimate public safety concerns with having these frequencies, like disrupting emergency services or traffic control or something like that? Or is this type of argument exist, and two, is it a legitimate argument, or is it just basically pretext?
The argument definitely exists. That's something that Ofcom says every time, and the same in the States whenever because they still, there's pirate radio too, and they still bust it, and they almost always talk about that. As far as I can tell, and certainly all the pirate radio, like the research on it, there isn't actually a ton. There's a lot of studies done by like the Ofcom and various entities. There's actually not that much scholarly work done on pirate radio, which was surprising to me, but Richard Barbrook is one of the people who's written about it. No one has ever found an example. Even in the reports, no one can ever give an example of, say, an emergency station being interfered with, like actually, or like a ambulance frequency. I mean, people know what those frequencies are.
Is it like when you get on an airplane and they say you have to turn off your cell phone because you won't be able to? Right, no one knows whether that's true.
That's the limit of my technical knowledge, so I don't know about that. But I will say, like, that's the pretext. I think the royalties thing is also interesting because that presumes that music would be played on the legal station, which a lot of the times it wasn't. So you get, and you also are getting people who are making tracks using samples, so they would have had to clear the samples to get the copyright to get it played on the radio that wasn't going to play their music anyway. So you know what I mean? So it's also that it was all circulating in a scene in which none of those things were the primary concern. And interestingly, in my earlier work, there was a little bit more about Jamaican stuff. I did interview a couple producers in London who sort of bemoaned the fact that, like, in order for credibility and to get big, they needed to have their music big on the pirates. But they did want to get royalties, and they knew both that if it was on the pirates, they would get respect, and their friends in the neighborhoods would be like, yeah, but that didn't mean any of those people were going to buy it. But they also kind of knew that the kind of people who pay for records is a different audience. Like, they were trying to figure out how to make that change, and a lot of that had to do with also the content of music. And this is also true in Jamaica, because within Jamaica, people don't pay for music in copyrighted music. People buy music sometimes as mixed CDs on the street, but they don't. There's not a lot of record shops, And there's this understanding. Some people pay for the recordings, and then there's other people that you do musical events with, and money circulates in other ways. So you can see a somewhat of parallel in the Jamaican case. Was there a hand over here?
Yeah, I was wondering, given the time frame that you're talking about here in the 80s and 90s, there was a pretty active pirate radio movement here in the States, which actually seemed to fall more under free radio, right? But I was wondering if there was much crosstalk between, say, free pirate radio broadcasters here in the States and over in England, or if this situation is seen kind of just arose indigenously without much.
That's a good question. I certainly don't, I didn't come across many people referring to that. Like the big discussion about relationships with US radio happened in the earlier era because you had American radio and record labels, right, who wanted English people to buy rock and roll, so they were helping fund Caroline and a bunch of these other stations. So but it wasn't free radio, it wasn't like illegal or activist radio in the States. It was very commercial at that time. So yeah, later, I don't know many, and I know, like in the 90s, I've been to a couple of free radio places in England, and I mean, they were very locally minded, like extremely locally minded, like, 6 blocks around them locally minded. Yeah. So there are times when they connected with broader political movements, but not so much, I think, to the US. I mean, for me, what was interesting, and this goes back to that era as well, that in the UK, a lot of the anti-government activities, whether it's sort of ideologically anti-government like free radio, or people who are just trying to be sort of under the radar of the government, like pirates, or who the government is against them, whether they want it or not. All of them still have a lot of space granted to them by the state. So the fact that pirate radio was easier to do in England always than here. It was illegal, but it was kind of less illegal. Like the fines were lower, the punishment was not as harsh. And the same is true for squatting as well, right? Like you could have access to property that wasn't yours, and you could live in it without being kicked out or arrested. And that was guaranteed by the state, even though you were breaking the law technically, right? So you have this kind of interesting protected space that the state does have a bit of a hand in. And for me, it was always very interesting because people were often explicitly very critical of the state, but at the same time, they had a place to be critical from that in the US you didn't necessarily have. You didn't have any of those spaces. Like you were squatting here too, but it was much more marginal, much more illegal. So I think this is part of that. So I haven't looked at the free radio movement here, but I didn't get a sense there was much back and forth. It's an interesting question.
I know there was sort of, like, trying to relate to that. I remember being in London in the 90s and hearing DJs from Detroit and Chicago playing on pirate stations in London, because they'd come over to play in clubs and they'd be talked into coming and doing an after-hours set.
Yeah, definitely musical connections,
yeah,
for sure.
Big stories about big-name DJs like Derek May and stuff suddenly finding themselves in someone's kitchen in town, playing records and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think there was a lot more connection through the music scene than there was through the radio broadcasting, like people who were the sort of technical side more perhaps. But yeah, definitely you had that. And I think that, I'm sure that must have been interesting on all fronts, because it was that, Detroit had its own history with illegal spaces, but it was very different. So yeah, that's a great point.
I have one basic question. So you showed a cassette tape. Are there still practices of circulation and exchange of physical objects? Or
It's a great question, yeah. Yes, to some extent. It's interesting. I haven't been looking at the problem is now, I don't know what scene I would want to look at, because the rave scene doesn't mean anything anymore, because it is 3/4 at least, if not more, very commercialized. So there's a whole bunch of stuff circulating on the pop music level that's interesting in its own right, but kind of a different thing. I know in my work on Jamaica, what's interesting is that DVDs featuring videos from street parties now circulate.
Okay.
That's actually what my article is about, because it's a sort of another issue of it's not, they don't just circulate among people who were there, they circulate among people who not only weren't there but would never go there, which is kind of interesting, but not necessarily, I would say, liberating.
Yeah.
But yeah, in that case you have documents of events, right? And there are definitely, one of the things that circulates is there's a lot of nostalgia documents that circulate. So you get CD packs of great rave sets from 1995,
Okay.
and cassettes, and people are digitized. There's actually a couple different websites where people have digitized archives of pirate radio, which is one of those one day when I have time, I want to just sit and listen to. But you can find them. There's hours and hours. DJ Randall, who was one of the big DJs at the time, just digitized a ton of stuff, and you can find it online. So there's a kind of, because it's the kind of thing, radio is the kind of thing you get enthusiasts and sort of rogue independent archivists. People love to collect stuff, and it's a scene where people love to collect it, and luckily they like to share it, so you can find those things. I don't know if there's really as much of a business in that. There is also, of course, record collectors, and that is ridiculous business. If you go on discogs.com and you look at music from the rave era, the first track that I played, which is SL2 Way in My Brain, which is one of these early tracks. Basically what happens in the 80s is you have Acid House, which is kind of post-disco, electronic, bouncy dance music, and it starts to get faster, and then at some point reggae bass lines start to come in, and around this time Jamaicans are starting to come into the music scene, and I was trying to find out from people if there was a geographic reason for that, or if the demographics and the housing, I was like, that would be so perfect and mechanical, and things never work like that, and nobody could tell me for this true. But anyway, this track is from that, and if you look at the price on discogs.org or whatever it is for this original vinyl of this track, it's some insane amount of money. So there's there are enthusiasts who are trading in it too.
Yeah,
but I don't,
different than social.
I don't really know what material objects are circulating. I'm sure there must be something, but as far as I know, it's fueled more by alcohol and Red Bull. Which is another thing. If anyone is studying music, nobody seems to ever write about the role of alcohol in the finances of music, which is the role of finances, but I can't find anyone who's written about the economics of that, which I think would be really interesting. Anyway, so next slide.
All right, well, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
So if you have questions, how do they get in touch with you?
You can just find me at larisa.mann@gmail.com, so my first name dot my last name @gmail.com. Oddly enough, you can also find me at the Ace Hotel tonight from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. If you'd like to hear some music, I will actually be there. So come by for a drink.
That was well done.